Today we're going to take a look at Luke 9 verses 1 through 62 and see how the four-field strategy shows up in Jesus' ministry. Now in Luke 8 we saw Jesus modeling abiding, entry, gospel, discipleship, church, and leadership. And now in Luke 9 we're going to see Jesus as he sends his men out to do the exact same thing. And we'll see Jesus continue to model this strategy. So what we want you to do is go ahead and draw the four fields on a piece of paper and then annotate your observation and the verse in the appropriate space in the 6 elements of the four fields. So go ahead and buddy up, get in a group, read the chapter, and then write down your observations. Go ahead and pause the video right here. Now you probably found a lot more stuff than I'm going to point out in my observations, so great job on that. But let's look at some of the things that I found. So for entry, we see that Jesus is reproducing his entry strategy through the 12. And they go into towns and villages and houses. And as they go in power and authority to heal. They go as needy. They don't take anything with them. They go with a prophetic warning for those who reject the message. In the gospel, notice that Jesus is reproducing his gospel proclamation efforts through the 12. They are to proclaim the kingdom of God. And just like Luke 8, we saw that in other gospels, Jesus is proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. And to give a little bit more weight to this, look at verse 6 in chapter 9, where it says, "Departing, they began going throughout the villages, preaching the gospel." Now, either the disciples were disobedient or preaching the kingdom of God and the gospel was synonymous. In discipleship, as we mentioned before, Jesus does a lot of modeling in chapter 8. Now in chapter 9, he sends them out. Which really brings me to a crucial point about discipleship. A lot of people say they want the meat. Where's the meat of the teaching? Well, the meat in disciple making is not just the knowledge, but it's the application. That's where the real meat is. And that's when Jesus sends them out to do what they have learned. For church, they're on mission together. Once again, he doesn't send the disciples out alone. We know from other gospels, he sends them out in pairs. So they're together on mission. For leadership development, we see that everything in discipleship is a model for leadership development with a mind to reproduce a simple plan in the future. And then for abiding, we see that Jesus is following the Father's plan. In John 5:19, Jesus says he doesn't do anything that he doesn't see the Father doing, and he does the same things in like manner. The disciples obey Jesus, and then the disciples are trusting God while they're on their mission. Let's move to verses 12 through 17, where Jesus feeds the 5,000. Here in entry, we see how a go and tell entry strategy can lead to a come and see entry strategy. In the gospel, once again, we see the kingdom of God. In discipleship, he's modeling a dependence on God, trusting God for resources. In church, They're doing this together, but they're doing it with limited resources and trusting God to provide. For leadership development, Jesus is modeling faith and dependence on God. For abiding, the disciples trust Jesus and obey his instruction. In verses 18 through 27 for the gospel, Jesus would talk about his identity, the suffering that he would do, and then his resurrection. For discipleship, he's asking questions about his identity, helping the disciples figure out who he is. He also points out the source of spiritual revelation through the question asking process. And then, of course, he talks about the cost of discipleship. For church, they're again doing this together, and together for instruction and together for understanding revelation. And then for leadership development, we see that Jesus models his identity. He also raises the bar for discipleship by explaining what it means to really follow him. And then for abiding, the disciples are willing to follow Jesus and pay the cost, whatever that might be. In verses 28 to 36, Jesus goes up the mountain and we have the transfiguration. And we see Jesus focusing on the three as a part of discipleship, Peter, James, and John. And for church, we see the three together with Jesus speaking to Moses and Elijah. And so they're together witnessing this whole thing go down. We see for leadership development, of course, again, that focus on the three. And then for abiding, we see Jesus is abiding and the others are seeing the glory of God as he abides, as he does what the Father wants him to do. In verses 37 through 45, Jesus and the three come off the mountain, and we see entry as they come off the mountain into the harvest. In discipleship, the disciples are failing to cast out the demon. They failed. And then later on, they would not understand what Jesus was talking about. This is perfectly normal in the discipleship process. We are going to fail. Disciples are going to fail. We're not going to understand everything. And Jesus is patient throughout the process. For church, hey, they fail together. And they get to see the glory of God together. Failure is a big part of leadership development. And we see when Jesus actually does cast the demon out, we know from other passages from cross-reference that with this event, Jesus says it's going to take faith, prayer, and fasting. And so for Jesus to be able to do this on the spot, he must have been prayed and fasted up and had the faith. In verses 46 through 56, we see that Jesus is going to Jerusalem. For discipleship, Jesus is going to deal with some of the issues that the disciples have. They want to know who's the greatest. They are very exclusive. They want to stop people from casting out demons. And then they want to bring fire down on the Samaritans that wouldn't receive them. And Jesus addresses all these issues, and the root of these issues is pride. For church, they're wrestling with these issues, and this is an issue of pride, but they're wrestling through the issues together. Leadership development, even leaders have issues, and they need to be confronted, and we as leaders need to be humble and work on those issues. For abiding, we see that Jesus has the courage to correct, to speak truth when it's needed. In verses 57 through 62, you see that Jesus and his disciples are once again on the road. They're on the move. They're practicing the entry strategy. For the gospel, he actually tells one of the would-be disciples that he needs to go and proclaim the kingdom of God. Once again, a reproducing gospel strategy. And then in discipleship, Jesus models on how to raise the bar to find disciples. For church, once again, they're doing it together. For leadership, Jesus maintains the high bar for discipleship, and therefore it's a high bar for leadership. And for abiding, Jesus is doing exactly what the Father wants, not what people want. As we finish chapter 9, we see the pattern once again. In chapter 8, Jesus modeled the pattern. In chapter 9, he instructed the 12 to repeat the same pattern. Enter, gospel, disciple, church, leadership, abide. And now in Luke chapter 10, we're going to see Jesus not only instruct the 12, but the 70 to repeat the exact same pattern.